I set up my small tent on the edge of a forest clearing somewhere outside a quiet town in northern Minnesota. It was October 2019, and I was 31, tired from a long week of work, and hoping a night alone in the woods would clear my mind. I had camped many times before, but I had never camped alone in this exact area. Still, I felt comfortable enough. The place looked calm when I arrived in the late afternoon. The trees stood tall and thin around the clearing, their bare branches shaking slightly in the wind. The ground was covered with damp brown leaves, and the air smelled like cold soil. I pitched the tent, stretched out my sleeping bag, and placed my backpack near the entrance. Everything felt normal, and I didn't expect anything strange to happen. I noticed the sky starting to darken earlier than usual. Thick clouds crawled across the sky, heavy and uneven, almost like shifting piles of wet ash. Weather apps on my phone had said there might be light rain at night, but nothing serious. I didn't worry much. I liked the sound of rain when I slept. I boiled some water for a simple meal and ate quietly while listening to the wind move through the empty branches. The forest was strangely silent. Not the usual birdsong, not even the soft rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Just wind. That stillness made me feel uneasy, but I tried to ignore it. By the time the last bit of daylight faded, a drizzle had already started. I zipped myself into the tent and lay back, letting the sound of the rain hitting the fabric calm me. Felt peaceful at first. The rain was steady but not loud. I closed my eyes, trying to relax, but something in the air felt wrong. It wasn't anything clear or dramatic, just a sense that the woods were holding something back. Like the silence wasn't natural, like something was watching or waiting, though I couldn't say why. The rain grew heavier, and the wind pushed it sideways, making the tent walls shake. I kept listening to the storm, letting my mind wander, until I heard something else mixed with the rain. A faint thud, slow, dull, not like a branch breaking, not like an animal moving, but something heavier. I lifted my head and stayed still, listening. The rain masked the sound at first, so I wasn't sure if I imagined it. But then I heard it again, a heavy step on wet ground, far away, maybe 20 or 30 feet from my tent. I felt my chest tighten. It was probably a deer or maybe a big dog from one of the nearby houses. That's what I told myself. But the steps were slow and too deliberate. One step, a pause, another step, a longer pause. I wasn't used to animals moving like that. Usually they walk quickly or run or rustle around in bursts of movement. This sounded like something taking careful steps. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't even sit up. I just stayed still, listening with all my focus. The steps got closer, but not too close. They stayed near the tree line, circling slowly around the clearing. It was like someone or something was walking in an arc around my camp. The rain pounded harder, drowning out bits of the sound, but every few seconds I heard it again, steady and patient. My hands felt cold even inside the sleeping bag. The temperature had dropped fast, and the air felt wetter and heavier. I could hear the steps shifting slightly, like weight settling into mud. I had no weapon with me besides a small camping knife, which was nowhere near enough to make me feel safe. I thought about turning on my flashlight, but I didn't want to show movement or light. I wanted to stay quiet and invisible. Minutes passed, though they felt longer. The steps eventually stopped. Not faded away, just stopped suddenly. That silence felt worse than the sound. I strained my ears, trying to hear breathing or shifting or anything, but there was nothing but rain. The wind pushed water across the tent, making a constant hiss. I waited and waited, wondering if whatever it was had left or was standing still, listening back at me. After a long while, I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the storm had warped the sounds. Maybe water dripping from branches made patterns that sounded like footsteps. I tried to calm myself down, but my body stayed tense. I lay there staring at the dark roof of the tent, listening to the rain until my eyes felt heavy. I must have drifted towards sleep without meaning to. I woke up to a loud crack. My heart jumped instantly. It wasn't thunder or a branch breaking in the distance. It was close, as if someone had snapped a thick stick just a few feet from the tent. I sat up silently, every muscle tight. The rain hadn't stopped, but it was lighter now, and I could hear the forest more clearly. I heard breathing, not mine, not an animal's fast panting. Slow, steady breathing, close enough that I could tell it belonged to something standing outside my tent. I didn't dare move. I didn't even blink for a moment. I just listened. The breathing was deep and calm, almost like someone trying not to make noise but failing to hold their breath long enough. I felt the pressure of fear sitting in my throat, almost choking me. Then the shape shifted. I didn't see it, but I heard the faintest brushing sound against the wet leaves. A step, then another. It was right outside the thin wall of fabric, maybe no more than a foot away from me. I could imagine something tall standing there, motionless, watching my tent in the dark. I could feel its presence like a weight pushing down on the air. I stayed frozen for what felt like forever. The rain tapped on the roof. The breathing continued, slow and steady. My own breathing felt too loud, even though I was barely taking an air. My mind raced with possible explanations. Maybe a person, maybe a lost hiker, maybe someone drunk or homeless passing through the woods. But who would stand right next to a stranger's tent at 3 or 4 in the morning, not saying anything, not moving away? Eventually, the steps moved again. Slow, dragging steps like someone careful not to slip in the mud. They moved away from the tent, back toward the trees, until they blended into the rain. I didn't sleep again. I just sat there in the dark, waiting for the first hint of light. When dawn finally came, the rain had stopped. Everything was wet and cold, but daylight made me feel brave enough to unzip the tent. I stepped out, scanning the clearing. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just soaked leaves and muddy ground. But then I noticed the footprints. They were clear, deep prints left by heavy boots, not animal tracks. They circled the entire clearing in a wide loop, and then a second set came in much closer, right up to my tent. The footprints stopped only a few inches from where my head had been while I slept. I followed them with my eyes and saw that they led back into the trees. They didn't rush or run. They walked out the same slow, careful way they had come. I packed up everything as fast as I could. I didn't even think about eating breakfast. I just wanted to leave. The forest still felt quiet, but now the silence carried a different weight, like it held the memory of whoever had been there. When I finally reached my car and locked the doors, I sat there for a while, shaking. The storm had washed away many tracks in the distance, but the ones near my tent were fresh and deep. Someone had been watching me during the storm. Someone had stood there, breathing and listening while I tried to stay silent. The ending became clear to me as I drove away. That night didn't feel supernatural. It didn't feel like anything from a story meant to scare people with monsters. It felt human. That was what made it worse. A real person had been walking around my tent in the rain, moving slow, watching, waiting for something I never figured out. And the part that stayed with me the most was that they never said a single word. Not one sound besides those slow breaths and careful steps. I never went back to that part of the forest. I still camp, but never alone, and never without thinking about that rainy night in Minnesota. I still picture the footprints circling my tent and the way the breathing sounded just inches away from me. I never learned who it was or what they wanted. All I know is that they were real, and they were there, watching me while I slept in the dark woods with nothing but thin fabric between us. I planned the trip in late September of 2019, a time when the heat in most of the southern states had finally started to fade. I had been working long shifts for months and needed a break from everything: noise, work, people, all of it. I picked a remote area in northern Arizona, far away from the usual crowded campgrounds. I found a place near an old forest road that didn't appear on most maps anymore. A few hikers mentioned that the road still existed but wasn't used much, mostly because it got rough past a certain point and people rarely bothered driving that far. That sounded perfect to me. I wanted silence, open air, and maybe a chance to clear my head. I packed basic gear: tent, sleeping bag, food, a small stove, a foldable table, and enough water for a few days. I left Phoenix early in the morning and drove north until the landscape shifted from hot desert to pine forests. The air got cooler as I climbed in elevation, and by the time I turned onto the old forest road, the sun was already high and the trees were thick enough to block half the sky. The road was bumpy and narrow, just as described. Dirt and stones bounced under the tires, and branches scraped lightly against the truck as I went deeper. After about 40 minutes of slow driving, I found a small clearing to the right of the road. The grass was short and flat, which meant it had likely been used as a campsite sometime in the past, but the lack of any trash or fire pit made it look abandoned for years. I stepped out of the truck, breathed in the pine scent, and felt a sense of calm that I hadn't felt in months. I set up my tent near the tree line where the ground felt the most level. The forest around me was quiet except for a few birds and the faint sound of the wind brushing against branches. I walked around the clearing, checking the area, making sure there were no animal tracks or signs of recent visitors. Everything looked untouched. I felt completely alone, which was exactly what I wanted. I spent the first afternoon collecting scattered pieces of dry wood and stacking them near the fire ring I planned to make later. I ate a simple meal, then sat in a chair and watched the sunlight fade through the trees. The temperature dropped fast when it got dark. The air was cool but not freezing, and a soft breeze drifted through the clearing. I eventually crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to fall asleep. Sometime in the early hours of the night, I woke up to a faint sound. It was hard to tell what it was because I was still half asleep. At first, it seemed like something brushing against the outside of the tent. I stayed still and listened. The noise came again, light, slow, irregular. It wasn't the wind, at least not the kind I was used to hearing. The pattern felt too uneven, like something taking cautious steps. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon. Animals moved through forests all the time. I stayed still, waited, and eventually the sound faded. After a while, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped out and walked around the tent. I didn't see any tracks, at least none that I could easily identify. The ground was covered in a mix of pine needles and dirt, which made it hard to spot footprints unless they were deep or obvious. I brushed it off and made breakfast. The air was colder than the day before, and thin clouds drifted across the sky. I decided to explore the surrounding area. The forest road continued uphill, so I followed it for a while. The trees got denser and the path grew narrower. After about half a mile, I found an old scattering of rusted metal parts, maybe an old abandoned truck or equipment. It looked like it had been there for decades. I didn't stay long because the air felt strangely still in that spot, like everything was holding its breath. When I got back to camp, the clearing looked calm and undisturbed. I spent the day relaxing, writing in a small notebook I brought with me, and heating a simple meal as the sun dropped again. The evening sky had deeper colors, dark orange fading into purple. I made a small fire and sat near it until it burned low. When I finally lay inside the tent again, the cold felt sharper. I curled deeper into my sleeping bag and closed my eyes. It must have been well past midnight when I woke up again. This time, the sound wasn't soft. Something snapped a branch nearby. Clean, loud crack. My eyes opened immediately. I stayed frozen for a few seconds, listening. The silence afterward was tense, heavy, like the forest was waiting for something. Then came another sound, slow steps on dry needles, somewhere near the edge of the clearing. I could tell by the spacing that it wasn't a small animal. These steps were heavier, deliberate, and measured. I didn't move or make a sound. My breathing felt loud inside the sleeping bag. The steps grew closer, then stopped. The quiet after that felt even worse. I stayed awake, listening to nothing but the silence that followed. I didn't sleep again until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside and checked the clearing more carefully. This time I saw something. About 15 feet from my tent, near a patch of dirt where the needles were sparse, were footprints. Human footprints, barefoot. The prints were clear and deep enough to tell that whoever made them had stood there for a while. I stared at them for a long time, unable to understand why someone would be walking barefoot in the cold forest in the middle of the night. I didn't see prints leading in or out, at least none that I could follow. The ground was too uneven to track anything far. A wave of unease stayed with me all day. I kept glancing around the trees, scanning shadows, checking the edges of the clearing. The forest didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like it was watching me. I debated packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to run just because of a few footprints. I tried to calm myself by focusing on simple tasks, organizing gear, boiling water, cleaning the small pot. The routine helped a little, but every time the wind moved the trees, I tensed up. When night came again, the fear I tried to ignore returned. I double-checked the tent zipper and kept a flashlight close to my chest. I tried to sleep, but the silence was too heavy, and the forest felt too alert. Hours passed slowly, and I drifted in and out of shallow rest. Somewhere deep in the night, the steps came back. Slow at first, then stopping near the same spot as before. I didn't breathe. My heartbeat felt like it shook the tent. I could hear something standing still outside for a long time. Then, very faintly, came a soft exhale, not mine. A human breath. I stayed frozen until sunrise. When the sky lightened and the forest warmed, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. I walked straight to the spot where the prints had been. Fresh ones were there. Same size, same barefoot shape. The prints pointed toward my tent this time, as if whoever stood there had been facing me directly. My hands shook as I packed everything. I didn't bother eating breakfast. I threw my gear into the truck as fast as I could, started the engine, and drove without looking back. The trees rushed past on both sides as I followed the rough forest road back toward civilization. The farther I got from that clearing, the easier it became to breathe again. When I reached the main road, I finally stopped the truck and stepped out for a moment. The morning sun was warm, and the air smelled nothing like the cold pine forest I had left behind. I stood there, trying to understand what had happened. There was nothing supernatural about it. No ghost story. No strange creature. Just a person out there, barefoot in the woods at night, creeping close to my tent without making a sound. Not once but twice. Someone who didn't say anything, didn't reveal themselves, and didn't leave any clear tracks except the ones that showed how close they had been standing to me. That thought stayed with me longer than fear of any animal or story ever could. Because whoever it was, they weren't lost. They weren't confused. They had come close on purpose. I drove home with a tight feeling in my chest, knowing I would never camp alone in a remote place again. And the worst part was that nothing dramatic happened, nothing violent, nothing that would leave a scar or a wound. The only thing that stayed with me was the simple, cold truth. Someone had watched me in the dark, studied my camp, and stood only a few steps from where I slept, barefoot and silent. They didn't take anything. They didn't touch anything. They just came, watched, and left. And knowing that was more than enough to make me never return to that forest road for the rest of my life. I was 31 when I decided to take a short break from my job in late September of 2019. I had been working long hours for months, and my head felt heavy every day. I needed quiet, open space, just a place where nothing moved except wind and time. That was why I chose a small, old farm on the outskirts of a tiny village in southern Poland. It wasn't a popular vacation spot. Most people didn't even know it existed. That was the reason I picked it. The farm sat several kilometers away from the nearest paved road. The owner allowed campers to stay on the property as long as they respected the land and didn't go near the storage barns. The fields around the farm were wide and flat, with tall grass that brushed against my knees when I walked through it. There were patches of forest around the edges, but most of the land was open, quiet, and a little too still. I liked that. I wanted that. When I arrived, the sun was low in the sky. The light was warm and soft, stretching long shadows over the fields. I set up my tent far from the main house, close to a broken wooden fence that hadn't been repaired in years. The boards leaned in different directions, like they were tired of standing up. A dry smell hung in the air, mixed with soil and cut hay. I felt calm there, like the land was holding its breath, giving me space. The first night passed without anything strange. I cooked a small meal, walked around the field, and watched the sky turn dark. The stars were clear and sharp, like someone had cleaned the whole sky for me. I slept easily, maybe too easily. The next day, I decided to walk deeper into the property to explore the older areas of the farm. I found rusted tools half buried in dirt, broken wooden crates, tire tracks that led to nowhere, and a pile of stones that looked like someone had once tried to build something but gave up halfway through. Everything felt abandoned but not forgotten. It was the kind of place that carried memories in the ground, even if no one talked about them anymore. Later that afternoon, while walking near the tree line, I found something odd. The grass there was pressed down in a wide circular shape, like something heavy had been resting on it. The center of the flattened grass was darker, damp for some reason, even though it hadn't rained for days. Next to it, the ground was disturbed, as if someone had been dragging something long and uneven. At first I thought maybe it was a machine that had been moved, or maybe some kind of equipment. But there were no tire marks, no footprints, nothing usual. It made no sense. I tried not to think about it too much. Farms always had strange marks, strange smells, strange noises. That's normal for old rural land. At least that's what I told myself. That evening I went back to my tent early. The sky turned gray, and a cold wind pulled through the grass. I zipped myself inside and tried to read, but I kept hearing sounds in the distance. Not animals, not the wind, something slower, a steady rhythm, like steps. But whenever I paused and listened carefully, the noise stopped. Then, 5 or 10 minutes later, the pattern returned, faint and distant, but constant enough to feel wrong. I tried to ignore it and eventually fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. Not from a dream, my body just reacted. My eyes opened wide in the darkness. I didn't move. For a moment, I didn't even breathe. There was a noise outside my tent, a slow dragging sound across the dry grass, like something heavy was being pulled along the ground. It came from the direction of the broken fence. It wasn't fast or rushed. It was steady and deliberate, like whoever or whatever was making the sound wasn't in a hurry. I lay completely still, listening. The dragging grew louder, then stopped before reaching my tent. The silence afterward felt thicker than the dark. My chest tightened. I waited for what felt like hours, though it was probably just a few minutes. Finally, the sound returned, this time moving away. I didn't sleep again until the sky turned pale. When morning came, the whole field looked normal. Nothing seemed touched, nothing broken, nothing dragged. I checked the area where I heard the noise, expecting to see marks in the grass, but there was nothing. The wind blew lightly across the field, brushing everything clean. I tried to tell myself I imagined the whole thing, But the feeling in my stomach didn't believe that. That day, I kept closer to my tent. I didn't go far into the fields or near the tree line. I stayed where I could see everything around me. Around noon, I noticed something near the broken fence. A piece of cloth caught on a nail. It wasn't mine. It was dark gray, torn at one end, like it had been ripped off from someone's clothing. It swayed quietly in the breeze. When I reached out and touched it, I felt how stiff and dirty it was, like it had been dragged through the ground. The rest of the day passed slowly. Clouds built up in the sky, darker and heavier, turning everything underneath into a dull, flat shade. I felt like the whole farm was watching me. I tried to stay rational. Cloth on a fence wasn't strange. Old farms collect scraps, bits of clothing, pieces of fabric. People lose things all the time, but the dragging sound from last night kept circling my thoughts. That night, I didn't sleep early. I kept my lantern on and sat inside my tent listening to the wind. Hours went by. I tried to stay awake, but eventually my eyes grew heavy. Around 2 or 3 a.m., I woke again. This time the sound wasn't dragging. It was footsteps. Slow, heavy steps in the grass, maybe 20 or 30 meters away. They weren't wandering. They were coming straight toward my tent. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The steps stopped just far enough that I couldn't see anything through the tent fabric, but close enough that I felt the presence of someone standing there. Then the steps turned, moving along the fence, then away toward the deeper parts of the field. They didn't rush. Whoever was walking wasn't scared or lost. They knew where they were going. I didn't sleep again. When the first light broke, I unzipped my tent slowly and looked outside. The grass had been disturbed, not trampled, just pressed in a thin line leading from the fence to the distant field. I followed it carefully, keeping my distance, moving slowly so I wouldn't make noise. The line led almost to the same area I had seen the flattened grass the day before. And right there, in the center of that circle, the grass was flattened again. Fresh. The spot was darker this time, wet, even though the air was dry. I crouched down and touched it. My fingers came up slightly stained. A cold feeling crawled up my spine. I realized then that I didn't want to know the rest. I didn't want answers or explanations. Something or someone had been using that spot at night. Something had been walking the fields, dragging something through the grass, moving close to my tent without fear. I packed my things quickly. My hands shook, but I tried to keep myself calm. I didn't run, but every step toward the dirt road felt like I was pulling myself out of deep water. The field behind me looked empty, too empty, like it was waiting for me to stop and look back. I didn't. When I reached the main road, I finally breathed normally again. My shirt was damp with sweat, even though the air was cold. I kept walking until I reached the small bus stop that led back into town. I didn't look in the direction of the farm. I didn't want to think about who or what had been walking out there at night, pulling something through the grass, standing close enough to my tent that I could almost feel it. To this day, I don't know what was happening on that farm. I didn't report anything. I didn't call anyone. I didn't want to explain something I couldn't fully understand. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw in the grass. And I know that someone else was out there in those fields at night, long after any normal person should be awake. I never went camping alone again after that. Not on farms, not in forests, not anywhere open and quiet. Silence doesn't feel peaceful to me anymore. It feels like the moment before something steps out of the dark, slow and heavy, dragging something behind it, crossing the field straight toward me. And the worst part is that I didn't see anything. I didn't hear a voice. I didn't get answers. All I got was a feeling that the farm wasn't as empty as it looked, that someone used those fields for something they didn't want anyone noticing. And one quiet night, I came too close. I I still think about that week in the Austrian countryside, even though it has been years. It was the summer of 2014, and I was 26 at the time, too confident for my own good, too stubborn to admit that camping alone in a foreign country was not the smartest idea. I had been traveling through Europe for almost a month, moving from crowded cities into quieter landscapes. I wanted silence for a while, something that wasn't made of traffic and subway noise. That was why I picked a small valley near Spittal and Poetcharin, a place that looked peaceful in every photo I saw online. The hills looked soft, the trees thick and old, and there was a stream that ran through the middle of the valley like a silver line. It seemed perfect for a few days away from people. I arrived early in the morning after a long bus ride that twisted through the mountains. The air felt cleaner than anything I'd breathed in a long time, and the sky was bright with that sharp blue you get at high altitudes. I walked for almost an hour along a narrow trail until I found a flat area near the water. It wasn't an official campsite, but there were signs that other people had stayed there before. Burnt logs, smashed beer cans, and flattened grass told their own stories. I set up my tent near a fallen tree, making sure it was sheltered from the wind. I felt proud of myself for knowing what I was doing. Back then, I thought danger was something that only happened in news articles. The first day passed calmly. I explored the nearby woods, took pictures of wildflowers, listened to the stream moving over rocks. I ate simple food and watched the sun drop behind the ridge. The valley grew colder and quieter. When darkness settled, I sat outside my tent for a while, listening to insects buzzing in the grass. Everything felt normal, completely normal. The second day was when things began to feel wrong. Started small. I noticed footprints near the stream, prints that were fresh and deep in the mud, larger than mine, spaced wider apart. They were heading in the direction of my tent, but then curved away at the last moment. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a hiker, maybe someone who passed by early in the morning. But the prints didn't look like someone casually walking. They looked like someone trying to move quietly. Still, I tried to shake it off. I went for another hike, following a different path deeper into the valley. It was a long walk, about 3 hours round trip. When I got back, the first thing I noticed was the position of my backpack. I always kept it inside the tent, leaning against the right side. Now it was on the left side. Not thrown, not dumped, just moved, as if someone had picked it up, inspected it, and set it down in a different spot. Nothing was missing, and nothing else was disturbed, but the sight of it made something cold move through me. I didn't sleep well that night. The wind scraped against the tent, and every rustle from the trees made me open my eyes. I kept telling myself that I was overreacting. I was alone in the middle of nature. Of course there were sounds. Of course the wind would move things around. But around 2 in the morning, I heard something that wasn't the wind. It was slow, steady, and heavy. Footsteps, one after another, moving through the grass outside the tent. Not running, not wandering, walking with purpose, like someone trying not to make noise but failing because the ground was uneven. I lay completely still. My heart was beating so loud I felt like it filled the tent. The footsteps stopped close enough that whoever it was had to be standing just a few feet away from where I lay. I didn't move. I barely breathed. After what felt like forever, the steps slowly moved away. I waited almost an hour before I even sat up. It felt like the air inside the tent weighed 100 pounds. When daylight returned, I stepped outside and looked around carefully. The grass was flattened in a narrow path leading toward the trees. Someone had been there. Someone had watched the tent in the dark. By midday, my nerves were shot. I packed my things halfway, thinking I might leave early. But part of me didn't want to give up. It wasn't like anything had actually happened. A stranger walking by my tent wasn't a crime. Maybe it had been a lost hiker. Maybe someone exploring the valley. The rational explanations stacked up easily, but they felt hollow. I forced myself to stay one more night. I regret that decision more than almost anything else in my life. That evening, the temperature dropped suddenly. Dark clouds gathered over the ridgeline, and the wind carried a damp smell that warned of rain. I built a small fire and sat close to it, trying to stay warm. The woods seemed more crowded with shadows than the nights before. Every sound echoed a little too long. When the rain finally started, I crawled into my tent, zipped the entrance tightly, and wrapped myself in my sleeping bag. The rain grew heavier, a loud drumming on the thin fabric. It should have been a comforting sound, but it only made me feel more cut off from the world. Around midnight, the feeling of being watched hit me again. It was strange how strong it was. I couldn't hear anything at first, but my body seemed to sense something before my ears did. Then I caught it, the faint crunch of wet grass, slow and patient. Not from the path I had made, but from the opposite direction, where the ground dipped toward the woods. I stared at the fabric of my tent, waiting for a shadow, a shape, anything. Then I saw it, a tall figure standing just beyond the edge of the rain. Even through the fabric, I could see the outline clearly. The person wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. My throat went dry. I didn't speak. I didn't shout. I didn't even reach for anything. I froze like an animal caught in headlights. The figure stepped closer, slow and steady. I thought the tent would collapse from the sound of my heartbeat. The shadow leaned slightly, as if trying to listen for movement inside. The rain washed over everything, but this person kept standing there, soaked, unmoving. Minutes passed like hours. Then, without warning, the figure turned and walked into the trees. Not hurried, not panicked, just walked away, disappearing into the darkness like it was the most normal thing in the world. I didn't sleep after that. I sat upright until sunrise, every muscle locked tight. When the morning came, I packed everything in less than 10 minutes. My hands were shaking the entire time. I didn't bother checking the campsite. I didn't bother eating. I just left. The hike back to the road felt twice as long as it had before. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that tall figure somewhere behind me. But the forest stayed still, quiet in a way that felt almost staged. When I finally reached the road, I saw something that made me stop cold. On a patch of wet dirt near the edge of the trail, fresh footprints, the same size and shape as the ones I had seen near the stream on the second day. They were facing the direction I had just come from, as if someone had been standing there a short time before I arrived. I forced myself to keep walking, fast enough that my legs ached. When the bus arrived and I stepped inside, I felt the tightness in my chest finally ease. As the valley disappeared behind trees and bends in the road, the fear slowly drained, replaced by a heavy realization. Someone had been watching me for days. Not a lost hiker, not a random passerby. Someone who moved in silence, approached in the dark, studied my tent, inspected my things, and stood outside in the rain like it meant nothing. Someone who never tried to talk, never revealed a reason, never made a sound except for those steady footsteps. I never saw his face. I never learned who he was or what he wanted. But I knew one thing clearly by the time I reached the next town. Leaving when I did was the only reason nothing worse happened. I never camped alone again after that. And whenever I think about going back to Austria, I picture that silent figure in the rain, standing close enough to touch the thin wall of my tent. I picture the way he waited there, patient and calm, as if he had all the time in the world. And I remember that some places are beautiful in photos only because the danger in them never makes it into the frame. I was 31 when I decided to take a short hunting trip alone in the autumn of 2018. I had been working long weeks back to back, and the idea of quiet air and a slow campfire felt like something I needed more than anything. I chose a remote valley in northern Montana, far from towns, far from paved roads, and far from anything that looked familiar. I had been there once before with a friend years earlier, but this time I wanted the silence of going by myself. I packed light, just enough food for 3 days, my rifle, a small tent, and all the basics I thought would keep me warm and comfortable. I drove in late in the afternoon. The sky hung low with thick gray clouds, and the wind pushed dry leaves across the dirt path. The place looked different than I remembered. The trees felt taller. The brush felt thicker. Even the air had a colder bite to it. I followed a narrow track that ran between tall pines until it faded into nothing. Then I walked the last half-mile by foot until I reached a small clearing near a shallow stream. The grass was flattened there in some places, as if animals had been moving through recently, but nothing looked threatening. It looked like a place that belonged to nature far more than it ever belonged to people. I set my tent near the tree line where the ground was level, and I gathered enough dry wood to keep a fire going through the evening. Once the fire was lit, the orange glow made everything feel calmer. The sound of the stream mixing with the fire crackling gave me a feeling of being away from everything stressful. I ate a small meal, checked my gear, and made notes about the wind direction and the terrain. I wanted to wake up before sunrise to start scouting for deer. The first night passed without anything worth noting. I heard a few distant snaps deeper in the timber, probably from elk or maybe just branches falling. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing felt unsafe. I slept well. The next morning I woke in complete darkness. The cold had crept through my sleeping bag, and for a moment I just lay still, listening to the forest before moving. When the first thin line of pale blue daylight slid across the clearing, I stepped outside and stretched my legs. The air smelled like wet earth and pine sap. I grabbed my rifle and headed up a ridge not too far from camp, following tracks in the soft soil. They looked fresh, 2 deer, possibly a small group. The ground was still slightly damp from night frost, and I could see each hoof clearly. But as I followed them deeper into the woods, I noticed something else. A single print, much larger, pressed into a patch of mud near an uprooted log. It looked like a boot print, but the shape was odd. The heel was deeper than the front, and the toes pointed slightly inward. It didn't match any normal hiking boot I recognized. I stood there for a long moment, staring at it, trying to figure out how old it was. Maybe a day, maybe a few hours. It was hard to tell because the mud was firm but not frozen. I brushed it off as another hunter and continued on. By noon, I circled back to camp without spotting anything worth taking a shot at. The wind had picked up, and I decided to rest and wait for the evening. When I stepped back into camp, something felt different. My duffel bag was slightly shifted from where I left it. Not much, just a few inches. My cooking pot was turned upside down. My jacket, which I had left folded on a rock, lay on the ground with a small patch of dirt on it. I looked around for tracks, expecting to see signs of a curious animal, but the only prints I could find were mine. I told myself I must have moved the bag without remembering. Maybe I knocked the jacket off when leaving in the morning. I tried not to overthink it, even though something about it didn't sit right. The second night felt heavier. The wind made the trees sway and groan. The forest felt restless in a way I couldn't explain. I kept the fire burning brighter and longer than usual. Every now and then I thought I heard something moving in the distance, 2 slow steps, then nothing. I stayed awake longer than I planned, listening to every sound until the fire burned down to red coals and I finally crawled into the tent. I woke up sometime just after midnight. My heart was already beating fast before I understood why. I could hear something outside, moving through the brush with slow, uneven steps. It didn't sound like an animal. Animals move with purpose, with rhythm. This sounded like something unsure of itself, something placing each step carefully, testing the ground. The steps came closer. I lay completely still, barely breathing, waiting for the sound to fade. But it didn't fade. It stopped right outside my tent. I felt the air in my chest get tight. I waited for breathing, for growling, for some sign of what it was, but all I heard was silence. The zipper of the tent was inches from my face, and every part of me was aware of how thin the fabric was. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just waited. After several long seconds, the steps moved again. This time they moved around the back of the tent, slow and dragging. Something brushed against the corner of the tent, lightly, almost like fingertips. Then the sound drifted away into the trees, fading until I couldn't hear anything at all. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, gripping my rifle, staring at the dark ceiling of the tent. I told myself it had to be a person, maybe a lost hiker, maybe someone camping nearby. But no lost hiker walks silently around another person's tent in the middle of the night without saying anything. And no regular camper moves like that, slow and uneven with long pauses. As soon as the sky brightened, I stepped outside. The ground around the tent told the story clearly. There were prints, several of them. They weren't from boots. They looked more like old shoes with worn soles, the kind with barely any tread left. The toes pointed inward just like the one print I had seen earlier near the ridge. I looked around and scanned the tree line, but nothing moved. Everything looked normal, almost peaceful. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me long before I noticed. I made up my mind to leave that day. I packed fast, faster than I ever had on any camping trip. As I loaded my gear, I found something near the fire pit that hadn't been there the night before. A small strip of cloth, dark brown, almost black, caught on a branch. It smelled like old sweat and dirt. I didn't touch it for long. I tossed it aside and kept packing. As I walked back toward where I'd parked, I kept looking behind me. Every few minutes I thought I heard something. A twig snapping far off, a faint shuffle of movement. But every time I stopped to listen, the forest went silent again. I moved faster, almost jogging by the time I reached the tree line where my truck was hidden. When I finally saw my vehicle, I felt a wave of relief. But that relief faded the moment I noticed the thin smear of dirt on the passenger door, right near the handle, as if someone had touched it recently. The dirt was still fresh, not dried, not cracked. I climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine without wasting a second. As I drove away, the trees closed in behind me, and the clearing disappeared from sight. When I reached the highway, the world suddenly felt normal again. Cars passed by, the sky opened up, and the air felt less heavy. But even now, years later, I still remember the way those footsteps sounded on the cold ground. Slow, careful, watching. I never went back to that valley. I never even tried. And the one thing that has stayed with me more than anything is this. Whoever was out there was not lost, was not curious, and was not confused. Whoever was out there knew I was alone, knew where I slept, and moved through the dark like they had done it many times before. Leaving when I did was the best choice I made, because whoever circled my tent that night wasn't passing by. They were waiting for something, and I'm still glad I never stayed long enough to find out what. I went camping alone in the early autumn of 2019, in a quiet part of northern Idaho, a place where the woods looked almost untouched and the air felt colder than it should have been for that time of year. I was 24 then, and I thought I understood the outdoors well enough to handle a weekend on my own. I had hiked in different places before, slept in my tent during storms, carried my own gear for long distances, and handled long nights with no one around. None of that prepared me for how it felt to be watched by something real and human, something I couldn't explain away with stories or imagination. I picked a small clearing beside a narrow stream. The water was low and moved slowly between dark rocks. The clearing was flat, and I could see just enough sky through the tall pines to track the light during the day. I liked camping spots like that because they made me feel settled. The forest floor was soft with dry needles, and the whole place smelled like cold dirt and sap. I reached the spot late in the afternoon. The air was cooling fast, the kind of cold that makes your fingers sting when you touch metal. I unpacked my gear slowly, stacking everything in neat piles because I didn't want anything misplaced later. There was no one on the trail when I hiked in, and I didn't see any signs of other campers. The ground didn't show any fresh footprints or tire marks from anyone dragging equipment. Even the fire pit looked old, filled with gray dust and broken bits of charcoal that had been rained on many times. I set up my tent facing the trees so the morning light would hit it first. I hung my food in a sack between two trees, higher than my head, just to keep animals away. I ate early, heating a small meal on my camp stove. The woods were quiet except for the faint trickle of the stream and the wind brushing through the pine branches above me. The quiet didn't bother me at first. I usually liked when the woods fell silent before sunset. It made me feel like I was far from everything that made life noisy. I moved around the clearing a lot just to stay warm as the sun dropped behind the trees. The temperature fell fast. The kind of fast where the cold feels like it bites through your clothes even when you're wearing layers. I kept adjusting my jacket zipper and rubbing my hands together. When the light faded, the shadows between the trees looked heavy and thick, as if they were pressing toward the clearing. I kept telling myself it was just the early darkness and the cold making me nervous. When night settled, I climbed into my tent. The fabric made soft sounds when I shifted, and the floor felt colder than I expected. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, pulled the hood tight around my neck, and tried to relax. The air smelled like damp nylon and pine sap stuck on my clothes. For a while, I just listened to the normal night sounds. Branches moving, the faint water sounds from the stream, the tiny tapping of loose needles dropping onto the tent. Around midnight, something changed. It started subtly, nothing sharp or sudden, just a sense that the woods outside had gone still in a way that wasn't normal. The wind stopped completely. The stream sounded softer, almost like it was being muffled by something. The whole place felt like it was holding its breath. I shifted inside my sleeping bag, and the sound of the fabric felt loud in the silence. Then I heard footsteps. They were slow and heavy, not the light, quick sound of a deer or the stumbling noise of raccoons. These steps were deliberate, one at a time, pressing down onto the forest floor with weight. They came from somewhere behind my tent, maybe 10 or 12 meters away. They stopped sometimes, then started again. I could hear the pine needles crushing under each step. I held my breath for a long time, listening hard. The footsteps moved around the clearing, not close enough to touch the tent, but close enough that I could hear the earth shifting. The steps circled wide, almost like someone was walking at the edge of my camping area but avoiding the center. I kept trying to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a big elk, maybe a black bear, something that had wandered too close. But the pattern of the steps didn't match an animal. There was no sniffing, no random moving, no sudden pauses like animals do. Felt too cautious, too aware. The steps stopped again, this time directly behind my food bag. I waited for the sound of something pulling at it or brushing against the rope, but nothing happened. Just silence, thick and cold. I stayed inside the tent for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Eventually, the steps faded into the trees. I listened hard for a long time and didn't hear anything else. The forest stayed unnaturally quiet, and I couldn't fall asleep again. I just lay there, staring upward even though I couldn't see anything in the darkness of the tent. When the first light of morning touched the fabric of the tent, I unzipped it and stepped outside. The air was freezing and smelled sharp, like wet metal. The clearing looked the same, but the ground didn't. The pine needles around the edge of the area had been disturbed. I could see large footprints, not animal prints. The soil there was soft enough to show the outline of a shoe. I followed the tracks only for a few steps before stopping. They came from deeper in the woods, walked in a half circle around the clearing, and left in a different direction. They weren't mine. The ground near my tent entrance still showed my own footprints from the night before. These prints were wider, heavier, spaced farther apart. Someone had walked around my camp while I slept. My food bag hadn't been touched, and nothing was missing, but the prints alone were enough to make my chest tighten. The idea that someone had walked around my camp without saying anything, without making themselves known, felt worse than any wild animal could have. I spent a long time standing there in the cold air, staring at the prints and the dark line of trees where the steps had come from. The forest looked almost too dense, like whoever it was still standing behind some tree, watching. I kept scanning the tree line, expecting to see movement, but there was nothing. I didn't even eat breakfast. I packed everything as fast as I could, forcing my hands to work even though they felt stiff from the cold and fear. Every few seconds, I looked over my shoulder. The sense of being watched stayed the entire time, like a pressure on the back of my neck. When I finally started hiking out, the woods felt different than they had when I arrived. Every crack of a branch made me tense. Every shift of wind in the trees sounded like someone stepping through them. The trail felt narrower, and the shadows felt darker, like the daylight wasn't strong enough to push them back. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My legs were shaking, partly from the cold, partly from how fast I had walked. When I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror even though I knew no one was behind me. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles hurt. For days after I got home, I kept thinking about those footsteps. They weren't random. They weren't curious animal movements. They were human. Someone had walked quietly around my tent at midnight in the middle of nowhere, without saying a word, without touching anything, without leaving any sign except the prints in the soft ground. I still camp sometimes, but never alone. And I never stay in places where the woods fall too quiet. That night in 2019 taught me something I didn't want to learn. The scariest thing in the forest isn't the wildlife, or the dark, or any imagined creature. It's the people who move quietly, who watch without speaking, who walk around your camp in the middle of the night for reasons you never get to understand. That night didn't end with anything dramatic. I didn't get attacked, I didn't see the person, and nothing was stolen. But the fear stayed because the danger was real and silent. And the truth became clear only afterward, when I kept thinking about those slow, heavy footsteps circling me while I slept. That was enough to change the way I see camping forever, because I realized that sometimes nothing happening is the scariest ending of all, because it means someone was out there, and you never learned why. I had planned the trip for months, mapping out a remote section of the Cascade Mountains in Washington. It was the summer of 2018, and I had just turned 26. I needed a break from work, the constant hum of the city, and the mess of life that seemed to follow me everywhere. I drove my old Jeep deep into the mountains, past the last gas station and the final cluster of homes, until the pavement gave way to gravel and the air felt cleaner, colder, and heavier with pine. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing near a creek. The trees arched overhead, forming a natural cathedral of green. I parked, unloaded my gear, and set up my tent. I was alone, which I preferred. I had my sleeping bag, a small stove, a headlamp, and a backpack filled with food and water. I even brought a basic first aid kit just in case. The creek gurgled nearby, the only sound besides the occasional bird call. At first, everything felt perfect. I wandered along the trail, snapped photos of moss-covered rocks, and made notes about the wildlife tracks I found along the banks. As the sun began to dip, golden light spilling across the trees, I started a small fire, just enough to boil water for dinner. The sky darkened quickly in the mountains, and soon the stars were sharp and bright, piercing the black sky. I felt a kind of peaceful isolation I had never known. Around 10, I crawled into my tent, zippered it shut, and tried to sleep. The air was cooler than I expected, and the creek's constant murmur was soothing at first. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing odd sounds in the woods, the snap of a twig, rustling leaves, and something heavier, like boots crunching on gravel. I dismissed it as wildlife. Bears and deer were common here, and I had read enough survival guides to know that most animals would avoid humans if given the chance. About an hour later, the sounds stopped. The woods went quiet again, except for the creek. I drifted off, exhausted. I woke suddenly to a noise outside. My heart jumped. It sounded like something or someone was moving deliberately toward my tent. Heavy steps, not animalistic. My first thought was a hiker, maybe lost or careless. But the trail I had come in on was at least a mile away, and there was no light. I sat up and listened. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of a zipper being slowly drawn. My tent flapped slightly in the wind, or was it? My breath caught and my hands shook. I grabbed the small pocket knife I kept in my sleeping bag. The sound stopped, replaced by silence so thick it felt like it pressed against my eardrums. I realized I wasn't just afraid of someone outside. I was terrified that I couldn't see them. My flashlight was in the tent, but if I shined it outside, whoever it was would know I was awake. I decided to stay silent and still, hoping whoever it was would move on. Minutes stretched. Then I heard a low whistle, deliberate and slow, almost like a signal. My stomach nodded. Whoever was out there wasn't a random hiker. This felt intentional. My mind raced. I didn't have a gun, just a knife, a flare in my pack, and the fire that had long since burned down to embers. I tried to remember what I knew about self-defense in the woods. Stay calm. Don't make sudden moves. Make yourself look big. Stay aware. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I strained to hear anything. Branches breaking, the sound of a boot, a shadow passing behind the trees. I could feel the presence, a slow, creeping movement around the perimeter of my camp. Suddenly, a stone hit the tent. I jumped, my heart hammering, and it bounced off the fabric, landing near my feet. Whoever it was testing me, seeing if I was awake. I could smell smoke faintly from the fire, and it gave me a small, fleeting sense of control. I could at least see my immediate area. I fumbled for my flashlight, clicked it on, and shone it outside. Nothing. The clearing was empty, but the shadows seemed too dark, too still. Then, a movement at the edge of the clearing. Someone crouched near the tree line, watching. My first instinct was to scream, but I forced myself to stay quiet. The figure didn't run. It just observed. I knew I had to act. I grabbed my pack, stuffed my knife in my pocket, and quietly unzipped the back of the tent. If I ran to my Jeep, I had a chance. I waited for a moment, counted to 3 in my head, and bolted toward the vehicle, adrenaline surging through my body. I didn't look back. Branches slapped my face and arms, roots snagged my feet, and I almost fell several times. When I reached the Jeep, I fumbled with the keys, my hands slick with sweat. The headlights pierced the darkness as I slammed the door and locked it. I started the engine, and the figure at the edge of the clearing froze for a moment, then disappeared into the trees. I didn't stop driving until I reached a small town half an hour later. My heart was still racing, my hands shaking on the wheel. I pulled into a motel and stayed there the night, too jittery to sleep. The next morning, I called the local ranger station. I reported the incident, gave them a description of what I had seen. A man, mid-30s, wearing dark clothing, moving deliberately through the woods near a remote camping area. They told me they had received similar reports from hikers over the past few weeks and that local police had been patrolling more often. Apparently, there had been break-ins at campsites, and authorities suspected someone was watching campsites for easy targets. I had been lucky. My tent was visible, but I had a vehicle nearby and moved fast. After that trip, I stopped going to remote spots alone. I started camping in busier areas or with friends. The memory never left me. The feeling of being watched, the silent movement outside my tent, the stone hitting the fabric. I couldn't shake the idea that if I had reacted differently or hesitated, it could have ended much worse. I went back to that section of the Cascades a few years later, but I never stayed overnight. I drove through the same winding roads, past the same gravel trails, and peered at the clearing near the creek. It looked peaceful in daylight the way nature often does. But I knew better. I knew someone had been there, waiting, observing, and I had been lucky to escape. The experience changed the way I approached wilderness trips. I started carrying a firearm for protection, extra flashlights, motion sensing alarms, and always let someone know exactly where I was going. I learned to trust my instincts, to pay attention to the small signs. The subtle shift in shadows, the barely audible sound of footsteps that weren't mine. That night taught me that the wilderness is unpredictable, not because of ghosts or monsters, but because of people. And people can be far scarier than anything else you might encounter in the woods.